I stopped by Elijah Cummings' Catonsville office on Thursday afternoon after hearing about his death earlier in the day to ask if it would be okay for us to gather for a brief prayer service just outside the office doors later in the afternoon. Cummings' assistant, Katie Malone, was sitting behind her desk, looking both bereft and frazzled. You may remember Katie Malone. She is the woman whose home burned to the ground back in January of 2017. She and her husband lost 6 of their 9 children. She herself was critically injured, hospitalized for a while. She was out of work for all of that time, but she did not lose her job. Elijah Cummings, his staff, stayed with her and with them. He gathered the Malone family together like a father. And after Katie was released from the hospital, got back on her feet, she went back to work. So you can imagine how sad she was on Thursday. I didn't have a chance to ask her, but I don't think even she knew that Cummings was as sick as he was. It was only immediate family who knew, which is a tribute to that family and especially to the staff at Hopkins, where Cummings was in hospice care. There were no leaks to the press while he was there. Only a small group of the most important people knew that Elijah Cummings was coming to the end of his life, which was remarkable, really, for someone like Cummings, so popular, so well-loved, so in the public eye. Such a small group there at the end. But then that's kind of how it goes for us, isn't it? Even those of us who are less popular. My guess is that most of us have those 3 or 4 people, maybe 5 or 6 people, who make up the circle of folks we want to have around us when we really need them. Who are the few whose presence gives you strength? I'll bet most of us can name who they are right now. One of God's greatest gifts is for us to have that inner circle. You can't really tell from the content of the text Carrie just read for us, but the text is kind of a deathbed text. It's a text that was written toward the end, near the end of Paul's life. And maybe these are the very last words that Paul ever wrote. He wasn't in hospice care. He was in a Roman prison, but he was there for the second time. He'd gotten pretty old, and his prospects for release were very dim. So Paul sits down toward the end of his life, and he writes a letter that he knows might be his last. And in the letter, just before what we heard today, he mentions a few of those people in his inner circle by name, the ones he wishes were there. At the beginning of the letter to Timothy, he mentions, Paul does, Lois. Lois would have been around Paul's bed if she'd been able to, giving him a drink maybe, or urging him to sit up for a while. Paul was like a grandson to Lois. And Lois was the cool grandma, from what we know. The sage grandma that some of us have or had, and others of us have heard about. Lois always knew what to say to lift Paul's spirits. She was wise. She might have been a little sassy. Lois would tell old Paul just what she thought of him if he got too big for his britches, which he often did. Lois would look at Paul and know what he needed. Paul was thinking about Lois when he was in that prison. And sitting in that prison cell, Paul was also thinking about Lois's daughter, Eunice. Eunice, a chip off the old Lois block. The organizer, Eunice. Eunice was the one who would always make the phone calls, send out the emails, tell everyone whose basement church was going to be in that particular week. She was the kind of church worker, you know who they are, who would get things done. Eunice was the one, to be sure, everyone who came to worship had enough to eat, and that they all settled down when it came time for Paul to speak. Eunice, she could give you the stink eye, she could. Paul was thinking about Lois and about Eunice while he was in that jail. And of course, Paul was thinking about Timothy, Eunice's little boy. 3 generations in this inner circle. What a sweetheart Timothy was. Oh my. Paul was first introduced to Eunice's son Timothy when he was just a kid, coming up for Children's Moment. On that one Sunday when Timothy was maybe 6 years old, he was an acolyte for the first time. Stood there at the candle for 5 minutes trying to get it lit. Finally, Paul had to walk over and give him a boost. You've seen that before. And then Timothy and Paul forged this special connection that lasted through their lives. That one Sunday when Paul caught Timothy stuffing cookies in his pockets at fellowship hour and didn't tell his mom, just winked at him. Paul became aware of Timothy's potential for ministry. That one Sunday when Timothy bravely stood up. It was Youth Sunday, and he talked about what it was like to be bullied in school because he didn't like to play sports like the other boys. And how one of the only places where Timothy felt safe was at church. People are still talking about that worship service. And then after watching him grow up, Paul became Timothy's partner. On that glorious day when Timothy was ordained into the Christian ministry, all the elders laid hands on the young, kneeling Timothy that they were so proud of, the one with so much promise. Paul was right there. Remember the feel of his hair on his palms. We still call people who get ordained from a congregation Timothy, a Timothy of that congregation, or a Priscilla of that congregation if the newly ordained pastor identifies as a female. In fact, if all goes the way it's planned, we'll have an opportunity to ordain a Priscilla of this congregation shortly after Tori Wick graduates from seminary next summer. And then she'll go off, just like Timothy did, following God's call. Timothy, soft-spoken, a little reticent, but ever so wise. He was a perfect partner for Paul, who could be a real pain in the neck. Paul, who was prone to get himself in hot water, to say things to provoke people. Timothy and Paul. Since Timothy's ministry began, Paul and Timothy traveled together. They were a pair. They'd gone to Athens together, to Philippi, carrying Christianity from Asia all the way over to Europe. Hadn't been for Paul and Timothy, we might not be here. When it was time for someone to deliver Paul's scathing letter to the rowdy church in Corinth, the one that was falling apart, Timothy got the nod. Timothy had kind of a light touch, necessary for contentious situations. In this letter, 2 Timothy, Paul's last, after Paul reminisces about Lois and Eunice, his inner circle, and a few others in that circle, Paul gives a charge to his protege and friend and practically son, a long list of advice, and then sends it off. I'll bet Timothy was excited when the scroll arrived from Rome to Ephesus. Hey everyone, he finally wrote, it's Paul. You know how you can hear someone's voice in the way they write? I'll bet it was almost reassuring for Timothy to read all this good advice from Paul in a way that he could almost hear his voice. This is one of those letters in the Bible. To hear it read today, it feels kind of like an ordinary piece of scripture, but I'm thinking that the people who read it for the first time, Timothy and Lois and Eunice, were so happy to receive it from their friend, Paul. It became a treasured document. I have a canceled check in the top drawer of my desk at home. It's 18 years old, stated sometime January 2001. Just an old canceled check. But it was the last check that my dad wrote while he was in the hospital over at Hopkins before he passed away in February of that year. And it was appropriately made out to Christian Temple. Just can't bring myself to throw that old canceled check away. An old check, an old treasured document. 2 Timothy. I'm kind of thinking that 2 Timothy is one of those old letters that Timothy couldn't bring himself to throw away, which is probably why we still have it. These instructions from Paul to his friend about how to lead the church. The instructions from Paul to Timothy come rapid fire in this letter. You've heard them. These are things that Paul and Timothy had said together a lot, but he needed to remind them so he could hear his voice. Proclaim the message. Be persistent. Convince. Rebuke. Encourage. Timothy was a little timid. He needed the reminder. All that stuff was important for Timothy to hear. But then did you hear that great expression when Paul says, the time is coming when people having itching ears will accumulate for themselves teachers to suit their own desires. Paul talks about people with itching ears in this old letter. This sentimental old first century letter becomes a very relevant letter to times like ours. Itching ears. Isn't that great? Itching ears, just dying to be scratched. What are itching ears? Well, when you have an itch in the middle of your back, you really need someone to get after it right away. If you ever had a cast on your arm or leg and had an itch you couldn't reach, drives you crazy. Itching. Itching demands scratching. And when it comes to itching ears, I think Paul might be suggesting that itching ears are ears that need a certain thing in order to be satisfied. They aren't just satisfied to hear what's being said. They need to hear something that will relieve them. They need to hear it now. Itching ears that won't rest until they get the inside scoop on a rumor. Whether the scoop happens to be true or not, in order to be able to be the one who gets to tell everybody else. Have you ever known someone who just loves to have the information so they can tell someone else? Itching ears. Did you hear? No, really? Then what happened? Well, don't tell a soul because I can't be sure, but what I heard, itching ears. Itching ears might also be those ears that are so very eager to hear confirmation of what we already believe. It feels so good. We bring our itching ears to the TV news, listening to the newscasts, filled with people we already agree with, saying things we already agree with and believe to be true. The conservative itching ears listen to one network. The liberal itching ears listen to another. We bring our itching ears to church with us sometimes, wanting to hear about the God who agrees with us, but not so keen on hearing about the God who challenges us. How many of us have itching ears and choose our teachers because they suit our desires? Not necessarily because they bring us the truth we are reluctant to hear. There are plenty of opportunities for us to like or to challenge the things we see posted on Facebook and Twitter. But when was the last time we saw anyone post something that sounds like, you know, I've thought about it and I think I might have been wrong? You may have a point there. Paul can be a pain sometimes, but I think he spoke truth to his friend Timothy when he said that we all have itching ears that seek teachers to suit our own desires. That kind of behavior doesn't do anyone much good, whether it's in the White House or in our house. So maybe the thing for all of us to do in response to this letter is to identify and celebrate our inner circle, that group of people that we know we want around us. But then to celebrate a second group of people, an outer circle, if you will, a team of rivals. Maybe not as important as the first, but a second group of people we know well enough to trust to be our teachers. The first group, Lois, Eunice, and Timothy, are the people we will want around us at the end when we are too afraid to be by ourselves. The second group is very important to have along the way. Amen.